He went to demand an explanation, but one look into that baby's eyes was enough for everything within him to crumble. You'll understand why. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post every day. Continuing, the envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, sliding silently across the immaculate glass of the executive desk like a dry leaf carried by the wind. Edward Miller didn't even lift his eyes from the financial report he was analyzing with surgical precision, his attention absorbed by the numbers dancing on the spreadsheets projected across 3 simultaneous monitors. At 42, Edward had transformed his life into a symphony of punctuality and control, where every second was calculated, every movement planned, every decision weighed on an invisible scale that measured profits and losses with mathematical coldness. His assistant had left 5 minutes ago to fetch his 9:15 coffee, always 9:15, never a minute before or after, and the silence of the 42nd floor of New York City's most coveted commercial building was broken only by the almost inaudible hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of Edward's fingers on the Italian leather of his executive chair. It was the sun's reflection on the envelope that finally caught his attention. A white rectangle, with no sender, no stamp, no identification whatsoever that could reveal its origin. Edward frowned, a deep crease forming between his dark eyebrows. In 15 years of building a business empire, he had learned that surprises were rarely good news. Surprises were uncontrolled variables, elements capable of destabilizing carefully erected structures. With his fingertips, he pushed the envelope away as if it was something contaminated. Perhaps it was just another poorly drafted business proposal, a desperate attempt by some small entrepreneur wanting a slice of Miller Holdings' success. Or worse, perhaps it was another one of the anonymous letters that occasionally arrived, written by resentful former employees or frustrated competitors, full of empty accusations and hollow threats. But something about the weight of the paper, the slightly rough texture of the envelope, insisted on bothering him. Edward sighed, a low sound that was lost in the emptiness of the office. He picked up the letter opener, a solid silver object he had received as a wedding gift from his father-in-law, an irony not lost on him, and tore the paper with a precise, controlled movement. Inside, a single photograph slid out like a secret, freed from its paper prison. Edward held it between his thumb and forefinger, bracing himself for another cheap attempt at blackmail or extortion. He had seen it all over the years: doctored photos, crude montages, pathetic attempts to tarnish his reputation. But when his eyes focused on the image, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The photo showed a woman sitting in an armchair with floral fabric, the kind of simple furniture Edward hadn't seen in years, far from the minimalist and expensive design that dominated every room of his life. The woman held a baby against her chest, and even in the unprofessional quality of the image, Edward could distinguish every detail of the child's face with a clarity that left him breathless. It was like looking at a miniature version of himself. The same dark, penetrating eyes, the same face shape, even the small birthmark on the chin that Edward had inherited from his grandfather. The baby couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, and yet the resemblance was undeniable, astonishing, impossible to ignore. Edward's hands began to tremble. An almost imperceptible tremor that spread through his arms, climbed his shoulders and settled in his chest like a clenched fist. He turned the photo over with mechanical movements and found a line written in familiar feminine handwriting. "The time you waste now doesn't come back later." The handwriting was Marianne's. Marianne Spencer, the woman who had been his wife for 4 years, the talented architect who had given up her own dreams to build a life alongside him, the only person who had managed to penetrate his defenses and touch something deep in his soul before he decided that feelings were luxuries. Too dangerous for a man in his position. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, in an aseptic courthouse room, with cold signatures and mathematical divisions of assets. Edward had kept the company, the apartment on the Upper East Side, the country houses. Marianne had been left with some savings, the furniture she had so lovingly chosen during the first years of their marriage, and the small house in Willow Creek they had bought as a weekend retreat, but which had become her permanent residence after the separation. They hadn't spoken since then. There was nothing more to say. Edward had made his priorities clear, and children were never among them. Children were responsibilities he wasn't willing to take on, unpredictable variables in a life that demanded total control. When Marianne started talking about starting a family, about taking the next step in their relationship, Edward felt the walls closing in around him and did what he always did when he felt cornered. He cut the problem off at the root. Now, looking at that photo, Edward realized that he might have cut off more than he imagined. He rose from his chair with an abrupt movement, knocking over the crystal pen holder, which shattered on the floor into dozens of glittering pieces. He ignored the noise, ignored the papers that flew off the desk, ignored everything except the urgent and desperate need to find answers to the questions that bombarded his mind like grenades exploding in a war he didn't even know he was fighting. He picked up the phone and dialed the number he still knew by heart, even after all these months. The number he had deleted from his cell phone in an attempt to erase Marianne from his life, but which remained etched in his memory with laser precision. He called once, twice, 3 times until it went to voicemail, her voice soft and melancholic, asking him to leave a message. Edward hung up without saying a word. He walked to the panoramic window that dominated the entire west wall of the office, offering a privileged view of the city, bustling 42 floors below. New York City stretched as far as the eye could see, an ocean of concrete and glass where he had built his kingdom, but which now seemed strange and distant, as if he were looking at someone else's life through a blurred lens. His assistant returned with the coffee exactly at 9:15 as always, but stopped at the door when she saw the crystal shards scattered on the floor and her boss standing by the window with a rigidity she had never seen before. Edward looked like a statue, motionless and silent, holding something between his fingers with such care that it could have been a sacred relic. "Mr. Miller, is something wrong?" Edward didn't answer immediately. He kept looking out the window, but he wasn't seeing the city. He was seeing Marianne's face the last time they met, 3 months, before the divorce was finalized. She had appeared at the office without warning, something she never did, religiously respecting the separation Edward maintained between his personal and professional life. That day, however, there was something different in her eyes, an urgency he had chosen to ignore. "Edward, I need to talk to you about something important," she had said, her hands clasped in her lap, her fingers twisting in a nervous dance he knew well. It was what she did when she was about to say something she knew he didn't want to hear. "If it's about the divorce settlement, we've already discussed it. The lawyers are handling everything," he had replied without looking up from the documents he was signing, his voice laden with a coldness he had perfected over the years, as armor against anything that threatened his zone of control. "It's not about the divorce, Edward. It's about us, about what happened, about what could still happen if you just—" "There is no us, Marianne. That chapter is closed." She had been silent for a long moment, and when Edward finally looked up, he saw tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of anger or frustration. They were tears of a deep and resigned sadness, the kind of sadness that comes when one realizes that a battle was lost before it even began. "You're right," she had whispered, rising from the chair with a dignity that broke something inside Edward's chest, something he quickly buried under layers of justifications and rationalization. That chapter truly is closed. And she had left, closing the door with a soft click that echoed in the office like a coup de grace. Now, months later, Edward realized that perhaps she had tried to tell him about the pregnancy that day. Perhaps she had come to the office to give him a chance to be part of something he didn't even know he wanted, and he had cut that chance off at the root with the cruel efficiency of someone who had turned rejection into an art form. "Mr. Miller." His assistant's voice brought him back to the present. Edward turned, his eyes still focused on the photo he held, as if it were the last link to a world he was rapidly losing. "Cancel all my appointments for the rest of the week," he said, in a voice he didn't recognize as his own. "And prepare the jet. I need to go to Willow Creek." "But sir, you have the meeting with the Japanese investors tomorrow, and on Thursday is the project presentation for the—" "Cancel everything." His assistant blinked, confused. In 15 years of working for Edward, he had never cancelled a meeting, much less an entire week of appointments. His agenda was sacred, untouchable, a carefully orchestrated sequence of obligations that allowed no alterations. "May I know when you intend to return?" Edward looked at the photo again, at the little face that was undeniably his, at the woman he had loved and lost because of his own stupidity and pride. For a moment he felt dizzy, as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure if what lay on the other side was salvation or complete destruction. "I don't know," he finally replied, tucking the photo into the inner pocket of his jacket, close to the heart he had convinced himself for years he didn't need. Perhaps never. The flight to Willow Creek lasted only 45 minutes, but to Edward it felt like 45 years. Sitting in the leather seat of the private jet, he alternated between looking out the small window and turning the photo over and over in his fingers, as if he could extract more information from it through repetitive touch. The image was already slightly crumpled by his nervous hands, but he couldn't stop touching it, as if it were the only real thing in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. The pilot had asked about his luggage, and Edward realized he was traveling only in the clothes on his back and with his wallet. He hadn't planned anything, hadn't prepared a speech or a strategy. For the first time in decades, he was acting on pure impulse, guided by an urgency he couldn't name, and which grew in his chest like a storm forming on the horizon. Willow Creek was a small town in the interior of the state, the kind of place Edward would normally drive through without even noticing its existence. Simple houses, cobblestone streets, a central square with wooden benches where elderly people gathered to play dominoes on warm afternoons. It was the complete opposite of the world of glass and steel where Edward had built his empire, and perhaps that was exactly why Marianne had chosen to seek refuge there after the divorce. The taxi he took from the small local airport was a worn-out Corolla, with vinyl seats and a smell of artificial pine from the air freshener hanging on the rearview mirror. The driver, a middle-aged man with a grizzled mustache, tried to strike up a conversation about the weather and how the town had grown in recent years, but Edward responded in monosyllables, his mind entirely focused on what he would find at the end of that journey. He still remembered the address by heart, Hydrangea Lane 247, a small two-bedroom house that Marianne had fallen in love with during a weekend they spent there in their second year of marriage. She had walked through the tiny yard, pointing out where she could plant a garden, where she would put a hammock, where she would build a small studio for her architectural projects. Edward had bought the house in a quick negotiation, more to please his wife than out of any personal interest in the place. Irony of fate. Now it was the only property that truly mattered. The taxi stopped in front of the light blue painted iron gate, a color Marianne had chosen because it reminded her of the sky on hopeful days. Edward paid the fare and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, observing the house that seemed smaller than in his memories. The garden Marianne had dreamed of was there, blooming in vibrant colors even in late autumn. Yellow roses mixed with purple hydrangeas, and a small apple tree shaded part of the front porch. She had transformed that place into a home. Alone. Edward took a deep breath, adjusted his tie in a futile attempt to feel more in control, and pushed the gate open. The lock was not secured, another sign that this world operated by different rules than he knew. In New York City, locking everything with multiple locks was a matter of survival. Here, trust still seemed to be common currency. His steps echoed on the stone path leading to the front door, a sound that seemed to announce his arrival to the entire universe. The door was made of solid wood, painted white, with a small stained glass window at the top that cast blue and red light reflections on the porch floor. Edward raised his hand to knock, hesitated, then lowered it again. What exactly was he doing here? What right did he have to appear in Marianne's life unannounced after months of silence? What if the child wasn't his? What if it was just a cruel coincidence, a resemblance his desperate mind had exaggerated? But before he could retreat or rationalize his presence there, the door opened. Marianne stood in the doorway, wearing a simple navy blue cotton dress Edward didn't recognize, her brown hair pulled back in a messy bun from which rebellious strands escaped. She was thinner than he remembered, with deep circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, but her eyes were still the same, large, expressive, capable of conveying entire emotions with a single glance. At that moment, they expressed a mixture of surprise, resignation, and something that could be relief. "I knew you'd come," she said in a soft, almost whispered voice, as if speaking more to herself than to him. "I didn't know when, but I knew you'd come." Edward opened his mouth, but no sound came out. All the words he had rehearsed in his head during the flight seemed to evaporate. He stood there, a man who commanded meetings with hundreds of people, who made decisions that moved millions of dollars, who spoke 5 languages fluently, reduced to absolute silence by the sight of the woman who had been his wife. "Come in," Marianne said, stepping aside. "He's sleeping, but you can see him." He. A boy, then. Edward felt something contract in his chest, an emotion for which he had no name or control. He followed Marianne into the house, his eyes automatically registering the changes she had made to the space. Where before there had been modern and minimalist furniture, now there were cozy and colorful pieces, crocheted cushions, hanging plants in the windows, framed photographs on the walls, not the professional, impersonal photos that decorated the apartment in New York City, but images of real moments, captured with love and care. The living room was small but airy, with 2 large windows that let in the afternoon light. In an armchair with floral fabric, the same one from the photo, Edward realized, a baby was sleeping, wrapped in a yellow wool blanket. Edward approached slowly, as if any sudden movement could break a fragile spell. When he got close enough to see the child's face clearly, his legs almost gave way. There was no possible doubt. The baby was his miniature version, so perfect it looked like a computer montage. The same eyes, even closed in sleep, had the almond shape Edward had inherited from his Italian grandmother. The same line of the nose, the same full lips, even the small dimple on his chin that appeared when he smiled. "What did you name him?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse and strange. "Michael," Marianne replied, positioning herself on the other side of the armchair, as if to protect her son from a threat she couldn't define. "Michael Edward Spencer." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the impact of the words like a punch to the stomach. She had given the boy his name. Even after everything, even after he had rejected the possibility of a family, even after he had chosen work and control over love and connection, she had honored his paternity in a way he didn't deserve. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out in a voice he didn't recognize as his own, laden with a pain he had spent years trying to bury. Marianne looked at him, with an expression that mixed sadness and something close to compassion. "Do you remember the last time we talked about having children, Edward? It was 3 weeks before we decided to separate. You said children were... How did you put it?" She paused, as if consulting a painful memory etched in detail. "Ah, yes. You said children were unpredictable variables that would compromise the efficiency of your life structure. You said you had decided long ago that fatherhood was not compatible with your professional goals." Every word was like a blade, cutting through the defenses Edward had built over the years. He remembered that conversation, remembered the expression on Marianne's face when he uttered those words, with the coldness of someone discussing a cost spreadsheet. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after you moved into the apartment," Marianne continued, her voice remaining calm, but Edward could perceive the pain she had learned to carry alone. "I spent 3 whole days trying to find the courage to call you. I even dialed your number dozens of times, but always hung up before the first ring." She moved to the window, looking at the garden she had created with her own hands. "Then I remembered what you had said, and I realized that I already knew what your reaction would be. You would ask me if I was sure. Then you would ask if I had considered all the options. Then you would do a detailed analysis of how a baby would affect our lives, our schedules, our career plans. And in the end, when you realized I was determined to have the baby, you would say that you respected my choice, but that you were not prepared to take on the responsibility of being a father." Edward wanted to deny it, wanted to say she was wrong, that he would have reacted differently. But the words wouldn't come because deep down he knew Marianne knew him better than he knew himself. She had predicted his reaction with surgical precision because she had spent 4 years observing how he dealt with anything that threatened his zone of control. "So I decided It would be easier for everyone involved if I simply disappeared, she continued. You could continue your life exactly as you had planned, and I could raise Michael without having to deal with a father who would see him as a problem to be managed. But you sent the photo, Edward said, taking it from his pocket and holding it between his fingers as evidence of a contradiction he couldn't understand. Marianne turned to look at him, and for the first time since he arrived, Edward saw tears forming in her eyes. Yesterday was Michael's 2-month birthday. I was looking at him, seeing how much he resembled you, and suddenly a huge anger hit me. Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued. Anger at myself for making the decision alone. Anger at you for making that decision necessary. Anger at the whole situation. So I took this photo and wrote that sentence without much thought. I put it in an envelope and asked a friend to deliver it to your company. She wiped away a tear that ran down her cheek. I didn't expect you to come so quickly. In fact, I wasn't sure you would come at all. Edward looked at the baby sleeping placidly in the armchair, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. A wave of conflicting emotions hit him like a tsunami. Instant and overwhelming love. Devastating guilt. Regret that ached in his chest. Fear of a future he couldn't control. Can I hold him? He asked, his voice almost inaudible. Marianne hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. With careful movements, as if handling crystal, she lifted Michael from the armchair and offered him to Edward. The world stopped. When Edward felt the small warm weight of his son in his arms, when he looked closely at that perfect little face, when Michael opened his eyes for the first time and they gazed at each other, father and son recognizing each other in a connection that transcended logic or planning, Edward understood that his life had just split into 2 parts, before that moment and after that moment, and there was no turning back. Edward couldn't sleep the first night in Willow Creek. He had checked into the town's only hotel, a family-run establishment with just 12 rooms and breakfast served on a veranda overlooking the main square. Lying in a bed that was comfortable but too simple for his usual standards, he remained wide-eyed until dawn, endlessly reliving the moment he held Michael for the first time. The sensation was still etched in his arms, the warm, vital weight of a life he had helped create, but which had grown without his presence. During the 2 hours he spent at Marianne's house, Edward had made discoveries that shook the foundations of everything he believed about himself. He discovered that he could change a diaper with trembling but determined hands. He discovered that a 2-month-old baby's giggle was a sound capable of melting resistances he had spent decades building. He discovered that being a father was not a position one assumed gradually, but an instant and irreversible transformation that happened the moment one looked into a child's eyes. But more than that, he discovered that Marianne had transformed into an even more extraordinary version of herself. The woman he had left behind was talented and determined, but the mother he found was a force of nature. She handled Michael with a confidence that came from daily practice, anticipated his needs before he even expressed them, sang lullabies she had invented herself. There was a serenity in her that Edward didn't remember seeing before, as if motherhood had revealed a layer of her personality that had remained hidden during all the years of their marriage. And most painful of all, she had built that new life without needing him. The next morning, Edward appeared at the house door at 8 o'clock, carrying bags from a supermarket 40 miles away, because it was the only one that had an organic products section. He had spent an hour on the phone with a pediatrician in New York City, asking about ideal baby food, diapers, and age-appropriate toys. Marianne opened the door still in her bathrobe, with Michael in her arms, and found Edward standing there, with an expression that mixed determination and desperation. "I brought some things you might need," he said, lifting the bags like offerings, in an attempt at redemption. Marianne let him in without comment, watching him unload products she didn't even know existed. Imported Swiss formula, German hypoallergenic diapers, educational toys developed by child development specialists. Edward organized everything in the kitchen with the same meticulousness with which he organized his financial spreadsheets, creating categories and explaining the properties of each item as if he were giving a presentation to investors. "Edward," Marianne finally said, when he began to explain the nutritional benefits of a French baby food that cost more than the family's monthly grocery bill. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" "Try to buy your way back into our lives." The words hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. He stopped mid-motion, a can of formula in his hand, and looked at Marianne with a vulnerability she had rarely seen during their years of marriage. "I don't know what else to do," he said with a raw honesty that surprised her. "I don't know how to be a father, Marianne. I don't know how to fix what I broke. I just know that when I look at Michael, something inside me changes. Something I didn't even know existed. Wakes up and it hurts. It hurts to know he lived 2 months without me. It hurts to know you built an entire life without me. It hurts to know I lost all of this because of my own stupidity." Marianne sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, adjusting Michael in her lap. For a long moment, the only sound in the house was the baby's contented murmur as he played with his own fingers. "You haven't lost everything, Edward. You're here now." "But for how long?" The question came out before he could censor it. "How long? Before I convince myself that this is too complicated, that it's interfering with my career, that it would be easier to just send a generous child support payment and visit occasionally." Marianne studied him carefully, looking for signs of the sophisticated manipulation he had perfected over the years in business. But all she saw was a man genuinely terrified by his own capacity to destroy precious things. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "And that's exactly why I can't just let you come back as if nothing happened. Michael isn't a project you can manage from afar, Edward. He's a human being who needs consistency, real presence, not imported products and corporate solutions." Edward sat in the opposite chair, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table in a nervous rhythm. "What do you want from me, then?" "I want you to stop trying to impress us and start getting to know us. I want you to understand that being a father isn't a position you assume on a family organizational chart. It's a choice you make every day, multiple times a day. It's waking up at 3 in the morning to change a diaper. It's canceling a meeting because your child has a fever. It's accepting that your life won't operate according to spreadsheets and schedules anymore." She paused, observing his reaction. "And more than anything, I want you to stop trying to win me back as if I were a failed business that needs to be restructured. We're not a couple anymore, Edward. We're parents, and that's much more complicated than any romantic relationship." Marianne's words echoed in the kitchen like a gentle but unyielding ultimatum. Edward felt the ground moving beneath his feet, all his usual strategies proving useless in a situation that demanded something he had spent his entire life avoiding genuine vulnerability. "How do I do that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "How do I become the father he deserves?" Marianne smiled for the first time since he arrived, a small but real smile. "You start by staying, not occasionally, not when your schedule allows. You stay and learn who he is. Learn that he likes to be rocked to his left side when he's agitated. Learn that he makes a specific noise when he's hungry and another when he just wants attention. Learn that he sleeps better when someone is singing softly, in the room." Edward nodded, absorbing every word as if it were an instruction manual for a life he didn't know he wanted until 2 days ago. "And what about you?" he asked. How do we?" "There is no we, Edward. Not yet. Maybe never again. What I'm offering is a chance for you to get to know your son and for him to get to know you. The rest we'll see later." That same day, Edward called New York City and delegated the company's administration to his executive team indefinitely. He cancelled business trips that had been planned months in advance. He transferred important meetings to video conferences that could be done from Willow Creek. For the first time in 15 years, he put something above Miller Holdings on his priority list. He rented a small house 3 blocks from Marianne's house, a decision that generated curious comments in the quiet town where everyone knew everyone and news was rare. Edward Miller, the millionaire businessman from New York City, had moved to Willow Creek and could be seen walking the cobblestone streets every morning, on his way to the house where his son's mother lived. The first few weeks were a minefield of painful learning. Edward discovered that he couldn't calm Michael when he cried, that his hands were too big to change diapers efficiently, that singing lullabies was much harder than negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts. Marianne observed his frustrated attempts with a mixture of patience and amusement, offering guidance when needed, but letting him make the mistakes that are part of the process of becoming a father. Slowly, something began to change. Edward stopped trying to apply business logic to parenthood and began to follow instincts he didn't know he possessed. He developed his own way of calming Michael, a combination of gentle movement and a wordless lullaby he had invented during a sleepless night. He learned to interpret the different types of crying, to anticipate his son's needs, to find joy in tiny moments he would have previously considered a waste of time. But it was on a rainy afternoon, when Marianne had to go to a doctor's appointment and left Michael in Edward's care for the first time, that the transformation was complete. Edward spent 3 hours alone with his son, and when Marianne returned, she found them both sleeping on the sofa. Michael curled up on his father's chest as if that were the most natural place in the world. At that moment, observing the man who had been her husband caring for their son with a tenderness she had never seen, Marianne felt something stir within her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but perhaps it was the beginning of something that could transform into love, given enough time and patience. It was the beginning of hope. 3 months had passed since Edward's arrival in Willow Creek, 3 months that transformed the routine of the small town and, more deeply, the lives of two people who were relearning the meaning of family. Edward had adapted to the simple life with an ease that surprised even himself. His mornings began early, no longer with financial reports and calls to international markets, but with warmed bottles and lullabies for Michael, who now smiled every time he saw his father approaching. The house Edward had rented had become a second home for the baby. He had installed a crib in the master bedroom, filled the closet with carefully chosen clothes, and transformed the living room into a safe children's play area. Marianne observed these changes with conflicting feelings. Part of her rejoiced in seeing Edward's genuine involvement with their son, but another part feared that it was just a phase, a temporary passion that could disappear as quickly as it had arisen. Edward sensed Marianne's distrust and didn't blame her for it. He himself sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, wondering if he could maintain this new lifestyle indefinitely. His company continued to function without his constant presence, but he knew that eventually he would have to make important decisions about the future of the business. The question that tormented him was whether he could find a balance between his professional responsibilities and fatherhood, or if he would be forced to choose between the two worlds. The answer to that question came on a Thursday afternoon, when Edward was bathing Michael in the plastic bathtub he had bought specifically for Marianne's house. The baby was particularly mischievous that day, splashing water and laughing with an infectious joy that made Edward forget everything else that existed beyond those four walls. The phone ringing interrupted them. Edward hesitated, his hands full of baby soap foam, but Marianne gestured for him to answer. "It must be important," she said, taking over the bath. "No one calls you here unless it's urgent." Edward dried his hands and answered his cell phone, immediately recognizing the tense voice of his managing partner. "Edward, thank goodness you answered. We have a serious crisis here. The Japanese investors are threatening to pull out of the project if you don't return to New York City immediately to renegotiate the contract terms." Edward felt his stomach clench. The project with the Japanese represented almost 40% of the company's planned expansion for the coming year. Losing that contract would be a devastating, possibly irreversible blow. What kind of renegotiation are they asking for? They want to change all the share control clauses. They're saying your prolonged absence demonstrates a lack of commitment to the project. Edward, if you don't show up here by Monday, they're going to sign with the competitors. Edward looked at Marianne, who pretended not to be paying attention to the conversation, but whose shoulders had stiffened in a way he knew well. Michael continued playing in the tub, oblivious to the tension that had settled in the room. "I'll call back in an hour," Edward said, hanging up the phone. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Marianne finished Michael's bath with mechanical movements, wrapped him in a fluffy towel, and carried him to the bedroom to dress him in clean clothes. Edward followed her, knowing a difficult conversation was approaching. "You'll have to go," Marianne finally said, her voice carefully neutral as she dressed Michael in his pajamas. I don't know yet. Maybe I can resolve everything by phone or... Edward. Marianne turned to look at him, and Edward saw in her eyes a mixture of sadness and resignation that haunted him. You'll have to go. And we both know that when you go, you'll realize how much easier it is to manage your life from New York City, how much more efficient it is to deal with us from a distance. Edward felt as if he had been punched. That's not true, Marianne. I'm not the same man I was 3 months ago. Perhaps not. But you're still a businessman who built an empire, and empires need present emperors. She picked up Michael and headed for the living room. I won't stand in the way of what you need to do. What if I don't want to go? What if I tell them they'll have to accept the conditions I offered or find another partner? Marianne stopped at the bedroom door and turned to look at him. Then I would ask if you're willing to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of your life, if you're prepared to look at Michael 20 years from now and have no regrets about the opportunities you missed because of him. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang, and when Marianne opened the door, she found an elegant woman standing on the porch, tall, blonde, wearing an expensive travel suit and carrying a leather handbag that probably cost more than the monthly income of most Willow Creek residents. "Excuse me for disturbing you," the woman said with a slight French accent. "I'm looking for Edward Miller. I was told I might find him at this address." Edward appeared behind Marianne and froze as if he had seen a ghost. The woman on the porch was Isabelle Moreau, his ex-fiancée, the woman he had abandoned in Paris 8 years ago in a desperate flight that had almost cost him his life and definitely cost him his ability to trust in deep relationships. "Isabelle," he said, his voice hoarse, "what are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Edward. There are things you need to know. Things that should have been said a long time ago." Marianne looked from Edward to Isabelle, instinctively feeling that the arrival of that woman marked the end of something that had barely begun to blossom between them. Without saying a word, she handed Michael to Edward and went to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Edward stood in the living room with his son in his arms, looking at the woman who had been the cause of his first great emotional wound. 8 years, Isabelle. 8 years without a word. And you show up now? Isabelle entered the house uninvited, her eyes surveying the simple surroundings with a curiosity that seemed mixed with disdain. "I read about your divorce in the European financial newspapers. Then I heard rumors that you had disappeared from New York City. It wasn't hard to find out where you were." She sat down in an armchair without waiting for permission. "You always had a tendency to hide in small places when life got complicated." Edward felt a familiar wave of anger rising in his chest, the same anger he had felt that last night in Paris when he discovered the betrayal that destroyed not only their relationship, but his ability to trust anyone completely. "Get straight to the point, Isabelle. What do you want?" Isabelle looked at Michael, who slept peacefully in his father's arms, and something in her expression softened. "He's beautiful. He looks like you when you were a baby." She paused. "I want to tell you the truth about what happened in Paris, the truth about the baby we lost." Edward felt the world spin around him. All these years, he had carried the pain of Isabelle's betrayal, the humiliation of discovering she was having an affair with his business partner, the tragedy of losing a child he had begun to love even before it was born. Those memories had become the foundations of his inability to open up completely to Marianne during their marriage. "I know the truth," Edward said with an icy voice. "I was there, remember? I saw you with Pierre. I was at the hospital when you lost his baby." Tears began to stream down Isabelle's face, but she made no move to wipe them away. "The baby was yours, Edward. It was always yours. The betrayal. Pierre blackmailed me. He had information about illegal dealings my father was involved in. He threatened to destroy my family if I didn't do what he wanted." Edward felt his legs turn to jelly. He sat down heavily on the sofa, Michael still sleeping in his arms. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe—" "Because I was a coward," Isabelle said, openly sobbing. "Now, because I thought it would be easier to let you hate me than to admit that I had been too weak to resist Pierre's threats, because when I lost the baby, I also lost the courage to fight for what we had. The room was silent for a long time, only the sound of Michael's soft breathing breaking the tension. Edward looked at his son in his arms and felt a different kind of pain than the one he had carried for years, no longer the pain of betrayal, but the pain of loss, of wasted time, of opportunities for happiness that had been destroyed by lies and fear. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked. "Because I'm dying," Isabel said simply. "Cancer, maybe 6 months if I'm lucky, and because I saw you holding your son and realized that you finally found what you always wanted. But perhaps you won't be able to fully enjoy it because of the wounds I helped create." She stood up, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and walked towards the door. "Don't let the past steal your future, Edward. Don't let the mistakes I made years ago prevent you from being completely happy with the family you have now." And then she was gone, leaving Edward alone in the room with Michael in his arms and an entire world of truths to process. Isabel's revelation hit Edward like an emotional earthquake that shook all the internal structures he had built over the years to protect himself from pain. For 3 days after her departure, Edward could barely function. He carried Michael in his arms as if the child were an anchor, keeping him connected to reality, but his mind constantly wandered to the past, reprocessing memories in a devastating new light. Marianne observed Edward's state with a mixture of concern and resignation. She didn't know the details of the conversation he had had with the mysterious French visitor, but she could see the effects in his eyes, a kind of renewed grief that seemed even deeper than the pain he carried when he arrived in Willow Creek. On the 4th morning, Edward finally found words to share the truth. They were in Marianne's garden, Michael playing on a blanket spread on the grass, while watching the leaves of a tree move in the wind. Edward told her about Isabel, about the betrayal that wasn't a betrayal, about the child he lost without knowing it was his, about years of wounds based on lies. Marianne listened in silence, her hands clasped in her lap, absorbing not only his words, but the raw pain that shone through every sentence. When he finished speaking, she remained quiet for a long time, processing the implications of those revelations. "I'm so sorry, Edward," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm sorry for the pain you carried all these years. I'm sorry for the baby you lost, and I'm sorry to discover the truth too late to change anything that happened." Edward looked at her with a vulnerability she had rarely seen. "Marianne, I need you to understand. All these years, I thought I had been betrayed in the cruelest possible way. I thought the woman I loved had deceived me about the paternity of our child, that she had used me while she was with another man. It taught me that love was a trap, that trusting someone completely was giving that person the power to destroy me." He paused, looking at Michael, who had discovered his own feet and was examining them with childlike fascination. "That's why I created all those defenses with you. That's why I turned our marriage into a business partnership instead of a true romance. That's why the idea of having children terrified me, because I couldn't bear the idea of loving someone as much as I would have loved our child, and then being betrayed or abandoned again." Marianne felt a wave of compassion mix with the sadness she already carried in her chest. "And now that you know the truth, how does that change things?" Edward took a deep breath, searching for words for feelings he himself was trying to understand. "Now I realize that I wasted our marriage fighting ghosts, that I let the fear of a pain that wasn't real prevent me from fully living the love that was real. And," his voice trembled slightly, "and I realize I might be doing the same thing now." Marianne tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. "You're right about New York City. I need to go back and resolve the situation with the company. But you're also right about the fact that it will be easier to manage my life from there, to keep you as a responsibility I fulfill from a distance instead of a priority that demands my constant presence." He stood up and began to pace back and forth, his agitation growing. "But I don't want it to be easy, Marianne. I'm tired of choosing the easy path. I'm tired of protecting my heart from risks that may not even exist. I'm tired of living as if love were a weakness instead of the only thing that truly matters." Marianne stood up too, picked Michael up and positioned herself in front of Edward, forcing him to stop walking. "And look at her." "What exactly are you telling me, Edward?" Edward looked at her, at the woman he had loved imperfectly for 4 years and who was now raising his son with a strength and dedication that humbled him. He looked at Michael, who stretched his little hands out to him in an unconscious gesture of complete trust. And for the first time since Isabel had appeared at his door, he knew exactly what he needed to do. "I'm telling you that I'm going to New York City, but not to go back to my old life. I'm going to restructure everything, the company, my role in it, my priorities. I'm going to delegate daily administration and keep only strategic control. I'm going to transform Miller Holdings into a company that functions without needing my constant physical presence." He took a step towards her, his eyes shining with a determination she hadn't seen since the early days of their courtship, before he became a prisoner of his own ambitions. "And then I'm coming back here, to Willow Creek, to you. Not as a visitor or a weekend father, as someone who chose to build his life around family, not the other way around." Marianne felt her heart race, but she also felt fear. Fear of believing, fear of opening up again to the possibility of disappointment. What if you get there and realize you can't give all that up? What if you discover that your ambitions are stronger than your feelings for us? Edward took Marianne's face in his hands, an intimate gesture they hadn't shared in over a year. "Then I will have lost the only thing that truly makes me feel alive. I will have lost the chance to be the man my son deserves as a father and the chance to win back the love of the most extraordinary woman I have ever known." Tears began to stream down Marianne's face, but she made no move to wipe them away. "Edward, I can't go through this again. I can't go through another separation, another disillusionment. Michael can't—" "I know," Edward said softly. "And that's why I'm asking for time, not promises. Time to prove that I've changed. Time to show that I've learned from all my mistakes. Time to build the trust that I destroyed." He kissed her forehead gently, a chaste kiss but laden with promises. "I'm not asking you to wait for me, Marianne. I'm not asking you to believe in words. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove with actions that the man who is talking to you now is real, and that he came to stay." Edward left for New York City the next morning, but this time his farewell was different. He held Michael for a long time, whispering promises in the baby's ear about coming back soon, about being present for all the important moments to come. He hugged Marianne with a tenderness that spoke of beginnings, not endings. In New York City, Edward worked with an efficiency that impressed even his most dedicated employees. He renegotiated the contract with the Japanese investors in a way that maintained profitability, but drastically reduced his need for constant personal involvement. He promoted his executive vice president to CEO, keeping only the board presidency for himself. He sold the apartment on the Upper East Side and cancelled his membership to all the exclusive clubs he frequented, more out of social obligation than pleasure. More importantly, he started therapy. For the first time in his life, Edward submitted himself to the painful process of examining his emotional patterns, his psychological defenses, the traumas he had carried without processing properly. He learned to name feelings he had spent decades avoiding. He learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but the only gateway to real connections. For 6 months, he maintained a routine of commuting between New York City and Willow Creek. 3 days a week in the capital taking care of business, 4 days in the small town learning to be a father, and slowly working to regain Marianne's trust. He documented every one of Michael's first moments. The first time, he rolled over alone. His first real laugh, his first attempts to sit up. Marianne observed this gradual transformation with a mixture of cautious hope and genuine astonishment. The Edward who returned from New York City each week was progressively different from the man she had married years ago. More present, more connected with himself, more capable of real emotional intimacy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to rebuild not only a parental partnership, but a romantic connection based on who they had become, not on who they were in the past. They started with long conversations after Michael fell asleep, sharing fears and hopes with an honesty they had never achieved during their marriage. They progressed to hand-in-hand walks around town, rediscovering the simple pleasure of each other's company. It was on a December evening, when Michael was almost a year old and had taken his first wobbly steps in Marianne's living room, that Edward finally asked the question he had been keeping in his heart for months. They were sitting on the back porch, watching Michael sleep in the portable crib they had placed in the garden so he could get some fresh air. The night was warm, filled with the scent of jasmine Marianne had planted around the house. "Marianne," Edward said, his voice laden with an emotion he didn't try to hide, "I don't want to ask you to marry me to fix what I broke in the past. I want to ask you to marry me to celebrate what we've built together, to celebrate the family we are, the people we've become, the love we've learned to live without fear." Marianne turned to look at him, and in her face Edward saw no longer the wounded woman he had left behind, but a whole, strong woman who had chosen to love him not because she needed him, but because she wanted to be by his side on the journey they still had ahead. "Yes," she simply said, and in that word Edward heard not just an answer, but a promise of a future, a declaration of faith in the person he had become and in the love they had rebuilt from the ashes. The wedding happened 6 months later, in a simple ceremony in the garden of the house where they had relearned to love each other. Michael, then a year and a half old, wobbled down the improvised aisle carrying the rings on a small cushion too big for his determined little hands. Edward's family, initially skeptical about his life change, had been won over by the genuineness of the transformation they witnessed. Edward never moved back to New York City. They built a larger house in Willow Creek, with a studio for Marianne's architectural projects and an office where Edward could manage his businesses remotely. Michael grew up knowing he had parents who chose to be present, who prioritized family above everything else, who loved each other with the intensity of people who had almost lost everything and learned to value every moment. And on quiet nights when Michael was asleep and they sat together on the porch watching the stars over Willow Creek, Edward sometimes held Marianne's hand and silently thanked her for the envelope that had arrived that Tuesday morning, for the photo that changed his life, for the second chance he almost didn't have the courage to accept. He had learned, finally, that the greatest risk was not to love too much, but to love too little. And that lesson had saved not only his marriage but his soul.